The country that I have chosen and been assigned is Mexico. I was interested in researching this particular country because I am traveling to that area on vacation in January, and I thought it would be a unique experience to study this country in regards to organizational leadership before I visit it. Mexico is also a border country with ties to the United States, and there is a lot of legislation, trade, commerce, production, and immigration that overlap between the two countries. Throughout this presentation, we will look at two moral issues that affect organizational leaders in Mexico and walk each of them through the decision-making process. In order to gain background on the country before we begin, we must look at facts that may be relevant to the analysis of Mexico as a country in which to do business. These include how their government is structured. Mexico is a federal republic composed of 31 states. Their constitution, which was ratified in 1917, guarantees personal freedoms and civil liberties and also establishes economic and political principles for the country. This country is home to over 113 million people, making Mexico the 11th most populous country in the world, though it is the 5th largest in land mass. The capital is Mexico City. It follows a federal constitutional republic government and elects a president each year. Their current president is Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Mexico is the 13th largest exporter in the world, and a majority of its business depend on exports, particularly to the United States. Mexico's trade agreements also benefit and attract foreign factories, meaning many companies outsource from their origin countries and build factories in Mexico. President Obrador, who was elected in July, ran on the platform to end corruption in business rampant in Mexico, reduce violence, and address poverty. Drug cartels are also very prevalent throughout the country, as well as organized crime and corrupt local police and government officials. The first moral issue to be considered when looking at ethical business practices in Mexico is fairness. As stated, most of the countries between business and government experience a lot of corruption. Because of this, fairness is not always displayed, and companies who cannot afford payments to officials shoulder a majority of the burden and smaller reward. In an article published in WeForum.org, written by Harvey Kelly, he stated that corruption is a global problem. Despite codes of conduct, compliance programs, and policies, many of the world's largest companies continue to struggle in the face of corruption. The article goes on to state that when leaders fail to embrace compliance to ethical practices, it may send a contradictory message within the organization on whether a commitment to ethical business practices is truly important. Although bribery is illegal in Mexico, the action is widely used. In a profile on gov.uk about Mexico, studies found that bribery and corruption extend even to high-profile allegations involving representatives from main political parties. There are currently 10 former governors under investigation, one being prosecuted and one in jail for corruption. While Mexico is working to modernize corruption legislation, there is still a problem with cartel and government affiliation and favoritism being shown to certain companies based on their willingness to bend rules and compromise integrity for the cheapest bid. Our second moral issue we will discuss in further detail is harm prevention. While Mexico does have many factories and businesses, ethical treatment of employees is not always at the top of the list. Minimizing harm to employees is a way that Mexico overall can make their business practices more ethical. An article in Health and Safety magazine gathered thoughts from Chris Marlowe, Health and Safety Manager at Cambridge. He states that you can usually determine the safest behavior, but he rejects the notion that safety issues are black and white, saying there may be several choices to weigh in, and some are more safe and realistic than others. A post from getglobal.org discusses that in Mexico specifically, there are some serious human and logistical risks for some industries in certain parts of the country, but there are also precautions that companies can take to greatly increase their safety when operating in those high-risk regions. To look deeper at these moral principles, we have to take them through the decision-making method beginning in step 3. In a country such as Mexico, where corruption is common, organizational leaders have to decide whether or not they will take part in such activities. The problem we are facing here is that the corruption which causes businesses to either pay to be kept at the forefront or not pay and face hassling and unnecessary burden. Starting at step 3, we must look at relevant stakeholders. Stakeholders in this situation could be employees, organizational leaders, or the corruptors themselves. The next step is to identify the interests of those relevant stakeholders. Looking at employees, the company could face higher burden or shutdown, or risk being controlled by corrupt interests. Organizational leaders have an interest in this and that it will affect their ability to make the decisions or if they are the ones who make them at all. Corrupt parties such as drug cartels and organized crime groups have interest in whether or not the companies will act in a way that benefits them and makes them the most money. There are 2 possible alternative actions. Either pay and take part in corruption in order to keep your business at the top, or not pay and risk being treated unfairly for an unethical reason. In order to make an informed decision as an organizational leader, we must look at both the pros and cons for both options. This is also step 6 in the decision-making process. Pros for taking part in corruption are that your business will be kept favored by government or interested parties. Cons, however, are that you are not actually the one controlling majority stake in your business and you will have control taken away. Pros to not participating in corruption activities are that you know you are running a business with strong ethical conscience and you are not controlled by special interest groups. However, the con is that you may not be treated as fairly as those who are paying for their spot at the top or being controlled by parties with influence, even if your project or company is better. In step 7, we identify conflicting principles that arise in this situation. Principles involved include justice and non-injury. The principle of justice discusses an equal distribution of burden and benefit. If companies are involved in corruption, they may be receiving more benefit than burden or vice versa. This conflicts with the principle of non-injury. By not participating in corruption, companies will not be given a fair chance in the market and will not be favored by government or interested parties who run in corruption. Moving on to step 8, the moral principle is non-injury. This means that non-injury overrides the moral principle of justice. It is more important to adhere to ethical business practices, even if it means you may see more burden than others. In the long run, your company will not be put in harm's way or risk shutdown, and interested stakeholders will be happier. When looking at which of these conflicting principles are applicable, we jump to looking at each of these components to find a solution. The preferable action in this situation would be not to take part in the corruption and maintain using ethical business practices. Despite learning that businesses are more highly favored when they participate in corruption, the pro of not being run by special interest groups outweighs this con. When you are able to act in the interest of what is best for your company rather than what is best for a small group of people, you ultimately help the company thrive. As previously mentioned, corruption is illegal, so you are continuing to use ethical business practices and do not risk shutdown. The decision should then be vetted by other executives in the company who are not involved in the decision-making process. Now let's review the decision-making method for harm prevention. Going back to step 3, we must review the relevant stakeholders. In this case, that would be the employees, organizational leaders, and policymakers. Moving to step 4, we must also look at the interests of these stakeholders. For employees, that would be ethical and safe conditions. For organizational leaders, that would be having dedicated employees who are able to work in safe ways. And for policymakers, that would be new or current legislature. Moving on to step 5, there are 2 possible alternative actions. Either enforce ethical conditions or use the cheapest options. Looking at step 6, we must weigh the pros and cons for each option. Enforcing ethical conditions means that companies would follow the letter of the law, if not go above and beyond when working with harm prevention plans for employees. The pros to this decision are that employees tend to be more dedicated to the company and that the company really does care about how they are treated while they are on the clock. They are also safer when working conditions are ideal and can be more productive when they are not worrying about safety issues. The cons, however, are that harm prevention can be expensive processes, and making sure conditions are safe and implemented and maintained. There's also more red tape through specific government agencies and laws that must be met. The other alternative action is to use the cheapest option and ignore harm prevention, and save money by going with the cheaper safety option, which sometimes means doing nothing. Pros to this are that you have a higher profit margin. If the company is not spending money on safety equipment and training for their employees, they will have money to buy product, which means they will have more to sell. However, the cons could be greater workplace injuries when asking employees to work in unsafe conditions, and a reputation of being an organizational leader who participates in unethical practices. On to step 7, we must look at conflicting moral principles, which in this case are profitability versus respect for rights. The company has a responsibility to be profitable and make as much money as possible to complete promises made to stockholders. However, in being profitable, they can violate the principle of respect for rights because they are cutting corners in order to save money. In step 8, we find that respect for rights overrides profitability. This also comes to play in the hypernorm that everyone has the right to life, and not practicing good harm prevention could infringe on that right, making it take precedence over profitability. Because of this, the preferable action in this scenario would be to enforce ethical conditions and take all steps possible to participate in proper harm prevention. Not only does this respect the hypernormative right to life, but also the moral principle for respect for rights. As with fairness discussed previously, an organizational leader in Mexico who follows the letter of the law avoids shutdown and sanctions by the government. Thank you for taking time to listen to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed hearing about issues that organizational leaders could face in Mexico.